So, David, I'm sorry, you don't have an easy task. Your research is very specific. You'll come last. It's the end of the day. Please, everyone, once all this is done, we will serve dinner and aperitif to everyone upstairs. So be patient and attentive, please. David, you are also a political sociologist. Actually, you're also a former lobbyist in Brussels. You've changed careers along the path. You're now working with the French National Institute for Agronomic Research and the London School of Economics. And I wanted very much to invite you to contribute to this conference because you've been researching a rather obscure but essential question, that is, the regulatory power of scientists themselves. In a very interesting book published in 2011 titled Scientists and the Regulation of Risk, you documented how scientists play an increasing and essential role in the standardization of risk assessment. Given that these standards, such as international experimental protocols designed by the OECD, are used on a quasi-daily basis by public authorities for organizing the risk assessment of products before these are allowed to enter the market or not, I thought your contribution could be an excellent addition to this conference. I specifically asked you to answer the following questions. What defines...
My talk is already written, but I'll try to...
That's fine. You will hear the questions nevertheless. What defines acceptable evidence for policymaking, in particular for regulated industry products such as medicines, foodstuffs, chemicals? How are these definitions crafted and by whom? To what extent is this system permeable to special interest influence? So thank you again for coming, for joining our discussion. You have 20 minutes.
I'll jump in the topic right away and come back to things that were said in passing earlier by Silvio and others about risk assessment and regulatory science and what's called the paradigm of regulatory science, risk assessment. And basically, the question is risk assessment and regulatory science more generally, is it somehow the product of regulatory capture or not? I mean, this is a legitimate question since there are people here and there who complain about the fact that risk assessment produces a sort of a false sense of safety and of control, and that structurally, basically, it is not a very easy tool to ban products or to put products out of the market. Basically, it seems that structurally, and again, I'm not speaking. I mean, here I'm sort of conveying the thoughts of others. Basically, risk assessment will be biased towards sort of letting products go on the market and stay on the market. So there could be suspicions that, paradigmatically speaking, sort of risk assessment is captured. I mean, it goes in the in the interest of the industry to keep its products on the market. So that's the question I want to ask. Is this so? And if it is so, by what mechanisms, concretely speaking, does it happen? I need to make a precision first, because words are important, and some of the words we use generally to think about those things are not helpful. Regulatory capture, first and foremost, is a striking term, a spectacular term, but it's not helpful in this sense that it's very general. It merges different degrees and mechanisms of regulatory capture, and often we don't distinguish clearly what's going on if we think in those terms. So you will see that I will be speaking much more in terms of cultural capture, borrowing a term by a political scientist in the US, James Quack. As part of in a book that is in the reading list that you circulated on preventing regulatory capture. Science is not a helpful term either. You might be surprised to hear, but in fact, if we speak in terms of science, then we will be bound to speak in terms of knowledge that corresponds to certain ideals, and well, you choose the ideals, but it's going to be transparency and replicability and quantification, obviously, and so on. And if we think in terms, but we are bound to find that the research that is used for regulatory purposes is sort of at fault or at distance with these ideals. And therefore, we're going to end up in a fight between industry accusing NGOs saying, your science is militant science, our science is better. And then NGOs responding, you do corporate science, it's biased. And then researchers accusing experts of doing regulatory science, and trust me, in their discourse, regulatory science is almost an insult. So we end up with a not very helpful fight about, so where is really the true science? So what I'm going to do here is to switch and speak of regulatory knowledge, okay? And take this sort of basic assumption that to do regulatory decisions or non-decisions, that's important, we use knowledge of different types from different sources, potentially from very different sources. Some knowledge is very close to what we would call scientific knowledge, but the rest of the knowledge we use is sometimes very tacit. It's close to experience about products and knowledge of markets. I mean, all of that is invested in regulatory decisions. And so faced with that field of knowledge, the question becomes, so who selects the knowledge that is going to go into a decision? And since this is the topic of the conference, do industry actors have relatively more influence over this kind of selection of knowledge, and specifically more influence on what we can call standards of proof, standards of evidence, or again, the norms of regulatory knowledge? Because as you know, the knowledge that is produced for regulation is based on certain norms and paradigms. And so you know those names, those sometimes exotic names we get used to, but which are really exotic. So risk assessment and computer an allowable daily intake and you name them. Substantial equivalence, José Bové mentioned that. All of those regulatory concepts that define a kind of knowledge that should be produced to make a decision. And it does not only define a type of knowledge, it also defines a regulatory mechanism, how we make a decision based on that. And again, there are many more of these concepts. Nowadays, there are a lot of discussions about threshold of toxicological concern. The idea is being that, okay, if you can compare several chemicals, then if one is safe, the other will be safe too. And then we can let it go on the market and so on. I mean, there are many other examples. So what I want to do, and I need to go fast, I'm sorry, but since time flies, and Eric afterwards will have to wrap this up. I'm going to take one example and then try to show where does industry intervene, in the process of shaping this of regulatory knowledge kind of norms. So my example is drawn from the field of novel foods and functional foods. So there's one such norm of knowledge in the area, which is to say that when we are uncertain about one particular point after a risk assessment, then it is possible to set up a so-called post-market monitoring scheme. Okay, so PMM, post-market monitoring, that would be a sort of norm of knowledge. And the idea behind that is that there's a scientific side to the concept, which is that a post-market monitoring study can pick up certain effects, certain adverse effects linked to consumption of the product, certain adverse effects, not all of them. It's limited. And the sort of the more legal side of it is to say that such a study should only be undertaken to clarify certain points that are left open after a risk assessment on certain hypotheses that were developed during the assessment of the product, pre-market. Okay. So if you take that example, PMM, post-market monitoring, so how did it come about? First, it has a very long history. The first experiments of that practice and the first mention of that concept dates back to the 1980s. Okay? And it became a sort of common and acceptable sort of concept after a long transnational process involving experiments in various places, in various companies, in Japan, in Europe, in the US. Also some experiments in certain public research laboratories, certain experiments in certain regulatory agencies or ministries, like at the time in the UK, the Ministry for Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, who tried to push companies who were developing functional foods to test this kind of monitoring. So some sort of experiment going on here and there. And then a lot of assessment, and you could say theorization of that practice, with a lot of meetings of learning societies getting involved in the debate, trade associations also organizing their own discussion on the topic. And then you see the ILSI, the International Life Science Institute, setting up its working group to discuss the idea. And then, of course, you see emerging an EU-funded research project specifically dedicated, a work package dedicated to the idea, and so on and so forth. And also, obviously, the unavoidable OECD and WHO workshops with experts to discuss the practice. So a long transnational process of experimenting, reflecting on the concept to gradually arrive to one single and common version of it that is almost ready to be picked up in law. Okay? So what about the industry actors in that context? First, you need to recognize that they are here at the outset, okay, and sort of legitimately so, because it's the R&D departments of these companies, which I'm not naming here, but that just had the idea, try to test the practice, the first, and then try to elaborate on and to see the consequences of these kind of studies on what they would reveal of their products and what would be the regulatory consequences of delivering that sort of data and so on. So they are here at the outset, and they're developing the idea as part of early conversations with regulators and MAF, I mentioned earlier. Then in terms of all of these meetings through which the concept and the practice is sort of theorized and generalized, the industry is also present in most of these places. I mentioned trade associations, learning societies, ILSI, and so on and so forth. They would have, if you take one single company and people from the R&D service of that company, they would go to these different meetings and sometimes not just follow the discussions, but try to shape the discussions, obviously, make sure the sort of right people are represented to sort of carry on the discussion and make sure consensus is being shaped and so on and so forth. Make sure being consistent, sort of, and almost ubiquitous in this discussion transnationally. Okay, set up groups of people that over time are gonna think alike and look alike, and they therefore reinforce the concept. And there again, concretely, the companies that experimented post-market monitoring then went to ILSI to organize this working group and then set up the EU-funded research project and so on, and sort of diffused to make sure the discussion would continue.
David, excuse me to cut you, but perhaps not everybody is familiar with what ILSI is.
Okay, this is a slippery question, but the International Life Science Institute is, there are different qualifications for this institute, but it's it works by setting up working groups involving industry scientists and academic scientists to discuss issues relevant for the risk assessment of products, food products, chemical products, and it's funded by chemical and agrochemical and food companies. Okay, so I've seen the evolution over time about how the ILSI was presented, and about 10 years ago it was still presented as a scientific organization, and now it's it's a lobby group. If I use, it's not my words, it's Vito's words, okay? So you'll make your opinion on that. And then the third step is obviously lobbying stricto sensu. Getting the kind of, lobbying that Sylvain presented. Really trying to make sure you get specific access to the Commission, to the Parliament, to try to influence the writing of an amendment, of a guideline, and so on, okay? So, but in a sense, this kind of lobbying almost doesn't matter much if the rest of you could call the orchestration work that went on before to make sure there's an intellectual convergence around one way of thinking and one way of seeing the risk happened already, okay? So to conclude, I just want to give a few more general points to draw from this. I'll just reiterate that. I mean, really, you need to see lobbying not just as a question of the access that you're trying to get to one given policymaker to defend your product or influence the writing of legislation, but this sort of orchestration and circulation of certain ideas about policy and about how to test products. And this is happening very much upstream, and it's much more sort of, you could say, discreet and much harder to trace than any other sort of more direct kind of lobbying. I think, again, this kind of, you might have the impression that I've talked about something very specific, but in fact, shaping regulatory knowledge is really key, because what happens through that is that you set up the kind of knowledge and decision machinery that regulatory agencies need, to produce scientific opinions and decisions, and they do that day by day by dozens and hundreds and stuff. So if you set up the norm, if you set up the protocol, obviously you have a massive edge. Okay, perhaps two, three last points about the actors involved. In terms of considering the industry, we often speak about the industry as a whole, as if all of the companies together and all of the people inside the company were one and the same thing. Well, you need to differentiate between different companies who compete with each other through lobbying and through this kind of work. And you need to look inside companies. We focused a lot on what people in regulatory affairs would do and people who are sitting here in Brussels would do. But in that kind of stories, the fact that companies and large companies have big R&D departments with a lot of scientists ready to and able to produce these ideas, to defend these ideas, to publish, to travel to meetings, and to over long periods of time to shape thinking is really key. Okay. Last point. What about regulatory agencies in all of this? Okay, we have work by Dan Carpenter, a professor in Harvard, about what he calls the conceptual power of the FDA. Okay, and based on that work, we can say that agencies like the FDA and partly the Environmental Protection Agency also have some conceptual power. And in fact, if you trace certain regulatory concepts, if you trace, for instance, the history of the thinking in terms of phases of clinical trials, Dan Carpenter did the work and showed that the FDA has really been strong in that. I recently did work on the history of the QSAR concept, quantitative structure-activity relationship, which is applied in the framework of REACH. And there you can really single-handedly point to the EPA as being the source of that. Okay, so they have conceptual power. Compared to that, I would say, but again, it's inspired from my research, but it's not verified, that regulatory agencies in Europe are much more sort of takers of these norms rather than makers, okay? And that perhaps because they are younger and they are less well-staffed than their US counterparts, but that would be the sort of observation I can make. And even there, Dan Carpenter and his work on FDA now seems to diagnose the fact that there's a shift of the site of conceptual power from the FDA to global pharmaceutical industry, and he's doing work on that at the moment, and that would again show that these global industries are conscious of the needs and benefits of engaging in this transnational shaping of regulatory knowledge upstream of more concrete and direct lobbying on products and directives, and this is one important field and place where lobbying and potentially capture takes place. Thank you.
So, Franziska Achterberg from Greenpeace. I have I think it's more a clarification, really. So you used the example of post-market monitoring, but what I didn't get from your presentation is that a useful concept, or is it something that is only a trick for companies to pass products through the approval system that shouldn't ever have passed. Like, how do you see the concept itself? I mean, you did explain very well how it was shaped by large corporations and their R&D departments, and through various, upstream, you called it, cycles, sort of before it even became a regulatory a concept in the EU and elsewhere. But what I didn't get is like what you think the meaning of it is, and the usefulness. And second question is, you talked about how corporations and various institutes have shaped this. Has there been any influence by NGOs or any public interest groups in this process that you described?
In terms of the concept itself, what's the context? If you look at novel foods or functional foods, a sort of legitimate demand would be that at the time of risk assessment, we don't know everything about the effects of these products in larger populations. So just like we think in terms for medicines, clinical trials help pointing to certain effects, but we need to monitor what's going on afterwards, because then the product reaches much, much larger populations. So what really the challenge was for the food companies that were involved here was to restrict the possibility to do post-market monitoring, not as a sort of open and constant surveillance of the consumption of products, because that would tend to go towards post-market surveillance like for medicines, which is heavy and costly and so on, and to restrict it to only very well-identified topics. So that's what was written down in those guidelines and texts, and what's incorporated in the concept is that you only do post-market monitoring for certain things on which there are remaining uncertainties at the time of marketing. Okay, so you restrict the application of that technique to a narrower range of issues. Okay, so that's in this sense that the concept was sort of a defense for the food companies involved. So it differentiated from the sort of more ambitious surveillance that goes on for pharmaceuticals. And so, as far as I can tell, based on the concepts that I've followed and the histories that I tried to describe, no, and environmental or health NGOs are absent. Okay, so this might be changing. This might not be a sort of general observation, because in other cases this might not be the case. But yeah, basically they're not here. So.
All right. Thank you for the presentations. We're really touching on the heart of a battle with this concept as a presentation before. And in my little experience, these concepts most of the time have been designed not to find any problem, of course, and they're extremely difficult for NGOs to influence because of the types of resources needed to construct them, as you described very well. And my question is, sorry, I lost the thread, but no, I mean, the point is that even when the legislators express a clear will, like for example, I think for pesticide, the legislators say that peer-reviewed studies should be taken into account, for example. On GMOs in 2001, the legislators said indirect risk, cumulative risk, long-term risk have to be assessed. But then, if this is implemented by scientific committees or European agencies, then there is no control over that, and that's where this concept come into play. And in some cases, the way they are designed, they actually bypass, the will expressed by the legislator. So my question is that how to solve that? Could a solution be to hold the expert liable, legally liable, in case of problems, for example? Could a solution be to change the way they are nominated in the expert agencies, in the scientific committees? And for example, making sure you have industry expert on the one side, identified as industry expert, and experts, selected by NGOs on the other side, for example, that could be a way to really identify where the scientific uncertainties, the disagreements, and then the policymakers could take a decision, with this identified. I mean, what are the solutions to avoid this corporate capture on regulatory science?
Just a quick question. As your example is about novel food, so I guess about pre-market authorization, did you do any research or did you notice any difference in in processes that are pre-market authorization or post-market, bans. Because at the beginning you referred to the bias toward keeping a product on the market or a bias towards putting a product on the market. Like working on industrial chemicals, I see always the bias of keeping, and the burden of proof is on the regulator to show that the product has to be retired from the market, and it's very difficult to prove if there's a problem. So it would be interesting to see if there's a difference in bias towards pre-market and or post-market ban. So I'll keep it short.
Yes, I think we're seeing a change in the industry discourse and even the NGO discourse between certainty and uncertainty, between pre-market authorization, post-market authorization. Take, for example, the 21st Century Cures Act in the United States today, and what's being pushed by the pharmaceutical industry on both sides of the Atlantic, which is adaptive licensing, which is actually asking for early market access without going through the whole clinical trial process. And then we'll see if there's pharmacovigilance, we'll see if there's problems. We will discuss things afterwards because they want your product out in the market. Whereas the NGO community used to be applying a more complex science where they said there's lots of uncertainties and that's why we have to apply the precautionary principle. And often the industry was using a reductionist science that was kind of, monocausal. Well, this chemical does not cause this disease. And that uncertainty was being used by the NGOs to stop saying, because, well, now, obviously, the burden of proof is often the opposite. It's saying, well, okay, we are going to take on as industry the postmodern argument that science is very complex. There are tons of uncertainties, we just don't know. And we have to exchange. In the case of pharmaceuticals, what they're saying openly, the top scientific officer of the European Medicines Agency is, we have to make an exchange between certainty, less certainty, for more access to the market of our products, and more access, obviously, to patients, and et cetera. So we see, I think, a switch. Obviously, they're playing on both sides of the fence at the same time, the postmodern uncertainty argument and the reductionist science argument at the same time. But I think as NGO community, we have to be conscious of these conceptual, cultural kind of flips. And I've been flabbergasted over the last few years seeing how many of our opponents have made that switch from reductionist science to postmodern science, saying, just let 1,000 flowers bloom. Everything is uncertain. So why? So we should just bring it out to the market anyways and see if there are problems.
Do you want to answer now, or
can you answer? No, No, I'm sorry. We're already 45 minutes behind schedule, and we still need to hear the conclusions. The observations, at least, of Professor Milster.
So, starting from the last comment, yes, it seems to me that uncertainty is one also of these not helpful words because they're used for different purposes with different meanings by different people and often by opposite people. And it seems quite clear to me that, yes, there are, certain companies and scientists in companies or associated scientists who would stress uncertainties basically as a way to say that how shall I put this? To prevent regulatory agencies from making decisions, quite simply. To say, no, you cannot ban a product. There are remaining uncertainties. So which is the exact symmetrical discourse of environmental NGOs or environmental scientists would say, you cannot put that product on the market. There are remaining uncertainties. So you see, uncertainty is a battlefield in itself. So I totally agree with that. On the notion that it would be more difficult at the end of it to take a product out of the market than to put it on the market. One of the observations you can make is that the higher you set the requirements for evidence to put a product on the market, the more difficult you make the situation to take the product out of the market. And there's a very strong imbalance here because basically the kind of knowledge that we use to put a product on the market is experimental knowledge, okay, experimental tests, which you can control and replicate, and you can statistically control and so on. Whereas when you are in the post-market area, just like Eric mentioned in the question to David there, you end up with epidemiological work, and epidemiological work is much more difficult, obviously, to replicate. Epidemiologists refrain from speaking about causes. I mean, they identify correlations, but they would shy away from causes, whereas to put a product on the market, you need to, companies would say they have proven through clinical trial or what have you, that the product causes a beneficial effect and so on. So you see, in terms of putting a certain standard of proof, then by definition, structurally, it makes it more difficult to take products out of the market. Okay, what's the solution? As a social scientist, I'm not really well placed to make any sort of recommendation to imaging solutions, but it seems to me that one of the key things is obviously in terms of lies in the capacity of regulatory agencies to actually produce themselves these methodologies and protocols and concepts, rather than just follow the discussions out there. Okay, and obviously in Europe we rely a lot on scientific committees and external experts. And the EFSA, at its beginning in particular, it was very striking that its main scientific committee was constantly discussing concepts and ideas coming from ILSI rather than producing its own. And that, I guess, basically has also to do with the fact that it's borrowing the expertise of people outside rather than being in a position to produce its own. And but EFSA, in a sense, is not to blame for this. I mean, it's how legislation has designed it. So I'm done, I think. Thank you.